you guys for coming to my talk. As mentioned, I'm Lisa Brown. I'm a game designer. This is a very design-centric talk, and I've worked in both AAA and as an indie, and am doing the residency in academics for the year. So today I am going to be talking about the concept of juicing your game, which many of you may be familiar with, but if you're not, let me clarify what I mean when I say juice. When I talk about juicing your game or making like juicy feedback, I'm referring to in-game feedback, prompts and signals, polish in the game that create a very tactile sensation when interacting with it. So for example, this could be big things like screen shake and explosive reactions to an in-game event. It can be very small things like using squash and stretch principles on UI elements, or really subtle rolling motions when you highlight a menu item just to give it a little more tactile response. It can be camera work, like subtle camera work. It can be the polish and the sound that reacts to things in the game that just makes it feel alive and reactive. And I tend to use the word feedback a little loosely. Technically, that's referring to a game's response to player input. So for example, encrypted in the neck credential, when you splash through enemies or doors, there's like a little screen shake, but I also use it to refer to other responses in the game that give information to the player. So like how the UI is pulsing along with the rhythm, or the little fog of war lights are pulsing along. Since the game is very much about the beat, that sort of stuff is still giving information to the player. So I refer to it as feedback as well. So why do I care about this? I really love juicy feedback in games. It's near and dear to my heart, both as a player and a designer. When I'm playing a game and I notice the attention to detail and how it reacts to player input and these little polishy elements, I get really excited. I love implementing this sort of stuff. But I think juicing your game is important to talk about because it's one of the ways you can design a lot of little details to make your game better as a whole. But I think that it's more important than just having juicy feedback and polish in your game. That's just one step. And I think that tuning that feedback in a way that's coherent with your game is a whole other step. So for example, if putting the juicy polishy elements for their own sake in your game gets some baseline level of information across the player, it's some baseline satisfaction, then if you tune those juicy bits so that they align with the intent of your game, it gets more impact for the effort. Basically, juicing your game can serve a purpose beyond it makes stuff look cool, and that is what I'm going to talk about. And so today we're not answering the question, how can I juice up my game? We're going to be answering, how can I tune the juice in my game so that it's coherent? How do I make decisions about juicing that get the most impact for my player experience? And my goal is it's not to give you a step-by-step process for implementing feedback, but my goal is for you to leave with a better feel for how to make decisions about tuning feedback in your game, so it's doing the most work for your game. It's more about developing an intuition for feel than following a how-to process. So with that, this is how this is going to go down. I'm going to clarify a problem I see with how some games approach juicing in terms of coherence. I'm going to talk about feedback as an emphasis of player feeling. And then I'm going to go through some process examples of how I tuned juice in a game that I made earlier this year to illustrate these points. All right, so on to the problem. So I play a lot of student games. How many of you are students? All right, so a good chunk. And I really like playing student games because I think it's a good way of seeing what general industry practice and philosophy is trickling down and being absorbed by beginner game developers. So for example, if this were a graph of the games industry, and the top there is like industry work, and the bottom is where the students are, and the knowledge is trickling down the mountain of education there. That's sort of what I'm interested in. I feel like that is important seeing in student games. And I am happy to report that compared to 5 years ago, so I've seen a lot more cases of students taking the time to juice up their game, putting screen shake in there, putting like nice little polish elements, and it's great because it means the idea of feedback is being important, is being learned early by beginner game developers. And I think the reason for that, or a lot of that, has to do with there have been a series of really excellent resources on the topic being readily available over the past 5 years or so. This talks, The Art of Screen Shake, and the talk Juice It or Lose It are really common. books like Game Feel, these things do a really good job of introducing these concepts, and I see them frequently recommended to beginners in contexts like game jams and the like. So that's good, like more juice, excellent. But also in playing these games, I've noticed another trend, which is even though they were juicing up their game, like something about it felt a little off, like compared to the games by more experienced designers. And I couldn't quite tell. It was like, well, they have the screen shake, but something doesn't feel like completely satisfying compared to these games over here. And I couldn't articulate it because I tend to be the sort of person who feels things first before I'm able to logic them. So I knew something was off, but I couldn't articulate what it was that I felt was off. So I do what I always do when I have a feeling that I cannot articulate, which is I talk to someone who is really good at logicking things before feeling them. So I went and I talked to my friend Rami from Blambeer, who is a very logical person. That's one advantage. And he also has the advantage of having a lot of experience with all things screen shake, as you may see from like some of the games Blambeer has made. So I went and I chatted with him, and I said to him, something about these student games feels like they put screen shake in there because they read an article saying to put screen shake in their game, and not because it would serve the game as a whole. But I was like, I can't like pinpoint what exactly it is. And it turned out he had noticed much the same, so we brained on this for a bit to figure out what exactly it was that was feeling off about these student games in the way they were approaching juice. So we talked about the idea that juice and feedback are really just an emphasis of what the player should be feeling in the game at that given moment, and that the student game feedback we were observing either was mismatched with the player feeling or not specific enough, and so it only felt satisfying on a very surface level. Their juice was not coherent with the fantasy they were trying to sell in their game. And it's a bit like if you've ever seen a presentation on some like serious topic, but they put in all these like weird slide transitions and it doesn't really align with what the talk is about, and it just feels like it's just, you know that feeling? That's what it was. There's a mismatch with the feedback and the intent of that feedback. And after all, you can get really specific with this stuff. There's more than one way to shake a screen. Screen shake is just an emphasis of what the player is feeling in the moment. And Rami was talking about this, and he said, clean directional screen shake is controlled violence versus rotating chaotic screen shake is uncontrolled violence, which you can sort of see in the increasing chaotic response to these different weapons. The screen shake gets a little more radial and a little less directional. So it's just a way of violence is the feeling in the moment, but it can be emphasized in different and really specific ways. So what I was seeing when I was noticing this difference in the student games and how more experienced designers were juicing, it was probably a difference in process. People always say, well, you juice your game, well, but you're not actually juicing the game so much as picking a feeling that the player should be experiencing at that given moment in your game, and that's the thing that you're juicing. So when I say things like juice being coherent with the fantasy of the game, I mean you should have a clear idea of what the player should be feeling in the game at that important moments, and use your feedback and juice to emphasize those feelings. So I'm now going to go through my own process for tackling this for the purpose of examples. And I'm going to talk about a game last year that I made called Imaginal. Imaginal is a small personal game that I made. It's about catching lightning bugs. And the reason I'm using this game versus any number of other games that I worked on over the years is because Imaginal is a very different game from the sorts often talked about when people talk about juicing. Very often, resources on this topic refer to high-action games or really upbeat puzzle genres. And Imaginal is not that. It is a very slow, very calming, relaxing game. So it's a good example of a game where I couldn't just easily follow a step-by-step, how to juice up your game guide. There's not much room for screen shake in this game, and it's not a very bouncy, springy reaction game. But that doesn't mean it can't be juiced, just because it's a slow game. There are plenty of little pieces of feedback in here all throughout. It's just not the same sort of feedback you would see if you were doing like a high-action top-down shooter. So, okay, coherent feedback emphasizes what I want the player to be feeling. So then the first step was to identify what those feelings were. And how did I pick which feelings my game should be emphasizing in which moments? Now, as a quick aside, when I'm talking about what the player is feeling in this context, I'm not talking about emotions. Even though Imaginal did stir up a lot of emotions in people, that's just a whole other talk. When I say what the player is feeling, I'm talking more about a tactile, physical feeling. And granted, these two things influence each other a lot in a number of really important ways. But for simplicity of the scope of the talk, whenever I say, the player feeling, I'm talking more about the tactile feeling that they should be feeling at the moment over emotions. So with Imaginal, I knew pretty early on I wanted a game to be relaxing and that I wanted the player to be heavily focused. In fact, one of the things that inspired the game to begin with was one summer evening I was literally out catching lightning bugs, and I had not done it since I was a child. And when I was little, I had a rule that I would only catch lightning bugs when they were actually lit up. I wouldn't catch them when they were dark. And this is reflected in the game. But I remember that night, I was following an unlit bug with my hands, waiting for it to light up. And it was dusk, and the bug was very dark, and it flew out from the sky over some silhouettes of the trees, where it sort of disappeared for a moment. So that feeling, that really heavily focused feeling of tracking the bug, that's what I knew right away. I wanted to get that. I wanted to emphasize tracking for clicking. And I knew I wanted it to be very focused and very relaxed. So when you're tracking an object like that, it's a very strong feeling of focus. But the focus isn't tense, it's relaxed. It's not tense like, say, when you're trying to solve a puzzle in a survival horror game, and you're very focused in that case, but you're also super tense. But this, I wanted it to be focused, but still calm, still really relaxing. So with that, I ended up tuning all the feedback in my game to mostly emphasize these two feelings of calm and focus, although there were some other specific cases. And I noticed by doing this, it had somewhat of a loop effect, and players tended to be more perceptive of really subtle feedback, which I'll talk about in a bit. So now let's look at the pieces of Juice on Imaginal and talk about the process I went through for tuning each one and how each one wound up emphasizing these specific feelings, relaxation, and focus. And after that, I'll talk about some commonalities after the fact. And again, I want to repeat, I'm not showing you a how-to example that you should follow for your game. These are intended to be examples of my decision-making process and how I wound up with feedback that emphasizes the correct player feelings. So I'm going to talk about the flash cue, like the cue when the lightning bug lights up. I'm going to talk about, it's really subtle, there are these lights on the edge that informed people that they could go on either side of the screen. I'm going to talk about how I tuned the camera pan, and then I'm going to talk about the actual feedback that happens when you catch a lightning bug. So first up, look at the flash cue, which is probably one of the first bits of feedback I started really tuning in this game. It serves two purposes. One is that it's the signal for the player to click on a bug in order to catch it. And secondly, it serves the aesthetical of revealing the art in the game, because everything is in silhouette except when something is lit up, and then you see the art underneath it. And deciding on how this light-up effect supported the player feeling wasn't really the first goal. It was a bit of discovery. The very first thing I was trying to do was just figure out a way to make it look like the bug was lighting up. And I was trying different glow effects and changing the bug sprites to more saturated color, all these little things. But it was just I just wanted this to look like it's lit. That was the initial intent. And the main component of what I ended up doing for the signal is this light effect. I was using Construct 2. And this actually isn't a true light at all. It's just a trick using layers and blend modes. So if you have a layer of a black layer with a white sprite on it, and the white sprite's blend mode is set to destination out, it shows things underneath that layer. It's like a masking effect. And so in this case, there are these two white sprites. That's what they look like without the effect. They just mask and show what's below it. And it was a pretty simple effect. And I was like, okay, that'll look like light. Let's try that out. And I tried this super early. This is a really, really, really early prototype. And immediately I got the feeling of, okay, this is the right direction. I noticed trying it out for the very first time and being quite surprised at how beautiful the sensation of the light-up felt, even though it was over my temp mouse-drawn trees and art. It still felt very lovely. And I found myself anticipating and looking forward to those moments of light up, so I was really focused on the individual bugs. And I was like, oh, that's great. That's sort of the feeling already that I'm going for. So we're going to go this route. And I thought it was great because I wanted to get people tracking with their mouse instead of clicking everywhere. So to reward them while they're looking at what they're tracking and focusing on a bug was perfect. This is from a little earlier in development when I started to get my artist's work in there. And at this point, I'd add little colored glows to distinguish the different colors. And there was this really crisp audio tone so that when one lit up, it was just slightly startling. And this is the final version. And if you compare, it's really similar, but there's a lot of little extra details that I put into this Flash since. This is the sequence of events, so you can see there's a lot going on. You know, I'm lighting it up for a certain amount of time, playing a tone, doing things with the sprites, and so on. But I'm just going to talk about these 3 bits, because these are the 3 parts I tuned that ended up supporting the player feelings of calm and relaxation. These 2 are related, so I'll cover them together. This is basically the decisions I've made having to do with the timing of how long the bug would stay in a catchable state. And overall, the frame is rather short. It's like half a second. And you'll notice there's a period of time where the bug is technically still lit up, but you can no longer catch it if you click it. And that last bit was a piece of tuning I did based on some behavior I was seeing in playtests. When you could catch the bug for the full duration, there was a few frames at the end where it's pretty dark, but if you clicked there, you would still catch it. So I noticed people would sort of hover their mouse in the middle of the screen, wait for a bug to light up, and then like go over to where it was and click and catch it. And this is something you can still do if you've played a bit and gotten used to the movement. But the fact that people were doing it right out of the gate, it felt off. It felt like a really reactive behavior, like it was a Twitch game. And I was like, this doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel very calm. And it's just off. So when I shortened that actual catchable state and made the window small, I ended up getting the effect I wanted. And I knew I was on the right track when a friend of mine gave me some feedback. They said, you know, when a bunch of bugs light up on screen all at once, I feel overwhelmed by which one I need to go for, and I feel like there's too many options. Do you think you could make them stay lit a bit longer? To which my response was, well, good, that's a problem I want you to have. The problem was, I wanted it so that if people tried to reactively move towards the bugs, that they weren't going to catch any, and instead get them to be more focused. And after these changes, I saw the behavior tame. A lot of people started off clicking everywhere, but then over time, they would start just like tracking a single bug and just like ignoring the other ones, waiting for that bug to light up, and then click to catch it. And that was the exact sort of focused feeling I was going for. So the other bit of juicing I did on this light up was having to do with the other feeling I wanted, which was calm and relaxation, which was when the bugs light up, I spawned like a little particle effect that lingers at the end. But before I added this, something about the way, this is that early development GIF again, something about the way the lights went out felt very sharp. And it felt very sudden, and I think that might have been one of the things influencing people to try and play it like it was whack-a-mole, because it was like on and then like shut out. So it felt like a twitchy sort of clicker game. So I couldn't make the lights fade out more gradually because I wanted a small window, so I added this little particle effect at the end of the flash. And it's very lazy and floaty. The particles move really slowly. It stays in the place the bug was when it lit up. And it's kind of weightless. I was trying to get across this idea that, the bugs are just there. They're just doing their thing. They're chill. You should be chill too. And you might be thinking, that's a pretty subtle difference, and you are correct. These are tiny little tweaks that I'm doing. But as I go through these, you'll notice that this is a trend with all of these. Because I was pushing for a really focused feeling, players seemed more likely to pick up on very small changes that were extremely subtle. So basically, that was a light-up cue, and it emphasized focus in a couple ways. It was revealing very small windows based on beautiful art that were rewarding people who were very focused. The catch windows on the short side to dissuade people from playing reactively, and those particles at the end just make it sort of taper off in a nice, like calm, relaxing, lazy sort of way. All right, so the next one are these edge lights. This is a little bit of juice. It's a series of lights that show up on the edge of the screen, and it's the problem I was solving with these was I wanted a way to get people to realize that they could actually pan left and right, that there was more to the level. And I liked where I ended up with this, but along the way I was trying a bunch of stuff that just did not work out. The first thing I actually tried was, when you go over there, a big old arrow shows up, on the side of the screen if you happen to mouse near the edge. And functionally, this worked as a cue that you could pan, but it had some problems. It was big and ugly, and it stood out. There was no other UI in the game, and it was distracting when it showed up. Even in this temp art phase, it was too obvious. And when I made it so that it only showed up when you happened to mouse over there, people would accidentally trigger it and not understand what it was. It took, they were trying to focus on catching bugs, and then it just ripped that focus away. So I was like, okay, I need something that's present on the side of the screen at all times, but it's got to be really subtle. So I made this little gradient, and I thought, okay, people will see that those sides are soft, and that'll tell them that they can go left and right. And that did not work either because it was way, way too subtle. It did look kind of nice, though, but there was nothing about it that was cueing players to be like, I should go over there. But I did notice an effect that occasionally happened naturally if a bug lit off just off screen, where their light would poke in on the edge of the screen. And it was subtle enough that if you were focusing on bugs, it wasn't a distraction, but if there were no other bugs on the screen, it was enticing. People were used to mousing towards light, so they'd go straight over there. And this was happening as an edge case, so I just changed it. I made it so that anytime a bug flashed off the side of the screen, it put a little light on the edge, and it was starting to really work. So I thought, I'll put some more information on this bit of feedback. One of the things in the game is you'll occasionally run across blue lightning bugs. If you catch these, you get rewarded with a little snippet of text. And I noticed once players had caught a few, they started actively seeking them out, sometimes ignoring regular bugs to try and find these blue ones. So I thought, okay, if a blue bug flashes off screen, I'll put the little blue glow and particle effects there so people will know, okay, there's a blue one in that direction. And this is what it ends up looking like, and as you can see or possibly cannot see, it's a really, really subtle effect. Some of you might have a hard time even noticing here. So it's like wait for it, it's right there it was. Super subtle, right? You can barely see it. And I put this in, I thought, okay, this might be too subtle. The regular lights, they already have a bluish feel to them because of all the blue in the art. The blue one doesn't really stand out. I thought, okay, well, I put the blue one on for the blue bugs, so I'll just put yellow glows on for the yellow bugs, and that'll help distinguish them. But as soon as I put them in, it ended up not feeling right. The yellow definitely stands out. It's a very high contrast color with the blues in the sky. But the result was now that the lights on the edge of the screen were just like too distracting again. Once you were trying to pay attention to something in the middle of the screen, and it was just blaring off the sides. And of course, the blue light was still really subtle, so it didn't even help put attention on that. So basically, it made it feel really urgent. It made it feel like, I need to go over there right now. And even though it was just a really tiny color change. So since I wanted it to be, calm and not urgent, I ripped that out. I went back to super subtle mode, which I was, all my worries about it being too subtle were absolved in the next playtest, because I once again saw people focusing on finding the blue bugs, and they'd be panning over one direction, and that blue glow would appear, and they'd immediately switch. So it's okay, people are actually noticing this. It might be not be a conscious thing, but they're noticing it. So once again, they were very, very perceptive to subtle. And for some people really like these edge lights a lot. People call it out a lot. My brother just thought it was the coolest thing, and he is definitely not a game developer. So, he was excited when he noticed it. So something about it, even though it was really subtle, was delightful to people. All right, so tuning on that, these were originally put in as a cue that you could explore the edges. I used the lights and avoided the yellow glows because they felt less urgent. And the subtlety worked to stay out of the player's way when they were focused on the bugs, but they did catch attention once there was nothing else there. So it was just the right amount to get the focus in the right place. Okay, so the next piece of juice, I'm going to talk about the camera when you do go left and right. Now, cameras are really important when you come to juicing. There's a lot of ways you can change the camera or do subtle things to your camera to finesse the feedback in your game. and more than just shaking it around. There's actually a really great talk at GDC last year about the history of 2D game cameras, and they talk a lot about a lot of these subtleties. So if you're interested in cameras, definitely check that out. In my case, it was a very simple camera. The play field is super long, and it was all you could do was move left and right. That's all I needed to do, is make it so people can move left and right, but not have, they don't need to click on anything. It needs to be low impact because they're focused on catching the bugs. But just because it's simple, it doesn't mean there wasn't some complex tuning to get it feeling just right. Again, I did this in Construct 2. This is a bit of the logic of how that camera worked, which I'll go over later. But it didn't start out like that. It started out really simple. All it was if you're on the edge of the screen, lerp the camera to the mouse position. Super, super, super quick aside for anyone who doesn't know what lerping is. Lerp stands for linear interpolation. It's a math function, and it lets you find a value between two other values. So it looks like this, and you'll have A, which is the starting value, B, which is the ending value, and T is a number between 0 and 1 that tells you how far between those to give back. So for example, if I have a function that's every frame, lerp the camera to halfway between the camera and the mouse position, and you do that every frame, it will smoothly transition. So just super quick, lerping is a thing that you use on movement, on volume management, all kinds of stuff. This is what that really, really simple camera looked like. It's you're on the edge, it's moving, you move the mouse away, and it stops. And it's functional, but I knew right from the beginning that it didn't feel right. It feels really abrupt. The stop and sharp, the start and stop feel really sharp. It makes the camera feel laborious, mechanical. It's not relaxing, and it's distracting from what you're doing primarily in the game. So this was a case where I was okay, I know this camera isn't working. I know it's not feeling like I want it to feel like, and I know sort of the feeling I want to get, but I'm not sure how to implement that. So again, I do what I do when I can't articulate something. I go to people who have good logic brains. So I asked Jacob Koziel for help, who also, he's really good at all things juicing, and he's really good at cameras. So he helped me figure out how this camera pan should be based on what was happening with the mouse and how it should feel. So by contrast, the final camera, it eases in and out in a very, very subtle, almost sort of lazy way. If you're moving one direction and then you move the mouse to the middle, it has some momentum. It keeps drifting in that direction a little bit. And it feels really lazy and not urgent, just super chill. So all right, this feels good. And the way this works is the camera is constantly moving to the mouse, but the complexity comes in how the speed is calculated. So it's constant when you're on the edge, but when you're not, the speed lerps from the original speed down to 0. So it slows down the speed, but it doesn't affect the direction. So my takeaway from this is there's a lot of little fiddly bits to get this camera feeling just so. And similar to the edge lights, a lot of this camera tuning is about removing distraction. If a piece of feedback in the game wasn't emphasizing focus directly, it had to get out of the way. It had to stay subtle. And it was just a really chill, lazy feeling camera that got that relaxing feeling across. So the last bit I'm going to look at is actually feedback by definition of the term. This is the game's response to when you successfully catch a bug. And the juicing of this bit is probably the most like an action game than any other bit I've talked about, which is appropriate because clicking on the bug is the most action-like part of the game. This is the part that is rewarding you for being really focused on tracking those bugs. But there's still some tiny details that I did to have it maintain this feeling of calm to it. So as you can see, it's kind of sharp when you catch the bug. It flashes the screen. It'll play a really sharp tone. But it still has a bit of a taper to it at the end. This is a big process of what I'm doing just to show that there's a lot of little things going on here. If any of you have seen the Art of Screen Shake talk, you may recognize what I'm doing here, which is actually a fairly common thing to do in action games, which is as a response to an event, you just freeze the time scale for just a beat, so everything sort of just stops for just a couple frames. It's very subtle, but it puts impact on whatever that action was. And similarly, flashing a full screen effect at the moment of the catch, it does a similar thing. It just emphasizes the impact of the action that you just took, which is good for this because I wanted to try and emphasize that little jolt you get when you successfully do something after focusing on it for a while. So that makes sense that this was really action-y. And you can see it's pretty obvious, the full screen flash. And of course, this was, if you caught a blue one, it would be blue, and so on and so forth. But there's another part of the sequence that ended up being really important, which is instead of making the bugs disappear when you catch them, I shrink them down to the jar. This was actually something I did really early on. You click on a bug and it just goes whoop down into the jar. And the reason initially was, I just want to kind of make you realize you're catching these bugs and they're going into the jar. So that's a little thing I can do to get that feeling. But when I was adding the flash effect and trying to get it feeling really punchy and impactful, I thought, okay, well, just to have it be really impactful, I'll just make the bug disappear instantly and see how that feels. And this is what it looked like. And the moment I put it in, I was like, something about this doesn't feel right. And sitting down to figure out what exactly it was that it was definitely snappier and more jolty, but something about it was feeling too sharp, like almost violent. Like I kind of got this feeling that like the nice little particle effects were not lazy particles, that it just felt like I was obliterating this poor little bug into dust. So I, and you can see it here. You have the full screen flash, and then it goes dark really fast. Compared to when it was lit up, you have a little more taper of the light. But something about this one, it felt like I was killing the lightning bug. And I was like, no, I need this, that's not the feeling I'm going for. I wanted it to be impactful, but I still need to make it feel like it's calm and relaxing. So I went back to this one, which, it's similar to that flash effect. It's like punchy at the beginning, but at the end, there's just a little bit of a taper, and it's just a little more relaxed feeling. So, back to shrinking down the bug when I caught it. And this was more work, right? I had to get the tween right, and then I had to shrink down the light and make it appear on the right layer. It was more effort, but it emphasized the right sort of feeling, so it ended up being worth it. It felt kinder than what it was before. And speaking of other super, super, super subtle things, there's one tiny little bit that I'm doing that you probably won't even be able to see. But after you catch, there's this little after image of the jar that shows up, and it's really subtle. Like, I was like, okay, you can just barely see this. This might be too subtle. This is probably too much. But then I put it in, and Jacob played it, and he was like, I really love the subtle little after image of the jar. It makes the catch feel a lot better. So I was like, okay, maybe not too subtle. So with this was the most action-y bit of feedback in the game because it was supposed to be a reward for that jolt of success that you feel. The tweening down of the bug was in response to it feeling sharp to the point of violence and wanting to keep that sort of relaxed feeling taper off at the end. All right. So having looked through each of those, you may have noticed some commonalities among them, both in terms of process and the results that I got. So the first one was, even though each of these were tuned to emphasize a specific player feeling, they started out with more straightforward contextual or gameplay-related purpose. The flash was a cue to click. The edge light was information telling the player they could pan. These are, gameplay purposes. And some of them also had contextual purposes. Like the flash was, I just have to make it look like it's lit. And the tweening of the bug was, I want to make you understand you're catching the bug in the jar. So these all started out with purpose. It was the tuning of them where I pushed the player impact, the feeling that I wanted to go to. But they started out just like purely functional bits of feedback in the game. Number two, which is, I mentioned in all of these examples, the discovery that my players were really, really perceptive to subtle changes and details, possibly because of the atmosphere of focus we were creating. And I ended up taking this and putting it all throughout the game. So for example, the night sky transitions between 4 different light states, but it's super, super gradual between them. This is a time lapse sped up, and you probably can't see it because of the light, but you can see the transition between the light states, really gradual. The game is 7 minutes long. Most people don't consciously notice it until the end when the sun comes up. But it does, the time of night affects the tone of the insights you get, so it does still convey a bit of pacing. It's just not very, it's people notice it, but not consciously necessarily. Another super subtle thing I did was I put these really, really, really slow wavering motions on all the trees just to make things feel just a little less static, but it's like super, super slow. And even the jar has this sort of sparkly effect going on, this really, really slow transition. And the takeaway here, I guess, is that the mindset your game gets your players in might affect what sort of juicy elements they'll be perceptive to. And this is going to be different from game to game. This is very specific to like the tone and the feel of this game. And the third thing that you may have noticed was that the process for all of these things, for me, it was not a logical process because I'm someone who feels things first. Looking at this with the benefits of 20/20 hindsight, it makes it feel like I approached this in a very analytical way. But in the moment, I usually made the calls I did because I put it in, I was like, this doesn't feel right. Like this, something's wrong. Because once again, I'm the sort of person who feels things way before I logic them. However, I think the reason that I was successful in this because the whole time I had a very clear understanding of the player feelings from the get-go. If you have that up front, then whether you are a logic first person or a feelings first person, you'll have an easier time making the right decisions that wind up with your juice being coherent with the rest of your game. And I noticed this actually just in preparing for this talk. It made me like my intuition was more sharpened. So when I did Ludum Dare, there was this moment where I was tuning the screen shake I needed from this default radial thing, which was like not what I wanted, to this way more directional like pump. And it was through, I think, doing the analysis for this talk where I felt like it made me more in tune with understanding like the feeling that I needed to do and how to tune it. So self-analysis is good for that. And of course, the big question is, with all this talk of juicing and focus and relaxation, did it work? Did I make a game where my players felt primarily focused and relaxed? And I think I did, partially based on observation, partially based on the things people have said or written about the game. So yay for that. When I showed the games at events, I would observe people start playing the game like a clicker, click, 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 as like they're playing League or something. But very quickly, I noticed their behavior changing. They went from playing it like a clicker and grew like super focused on one bug at a time and following it through. So their behavior changed. And then, meanwhile, when I released the game, I had many comments about sort of the calm, relaxing nature of it. Some things people said to me directly, some things people wrote about the game. And then when showing it at events, the most common comment was, when someone finished, was, oh, that was really relaxing. So yes, the feelings I was trying to emphasize definitely got across. So to wrap everything up, using student games as a benchmark, I think the number of beginners that have taken the time to juice their games has increased, which is a very good thing, but I would like to see a comparable increase in juice that is coherent and tuned more specifically to the needs of specific games. I want to see that in the next 5 years. To get that increase, I want to see more depth in student use of feedback as emphasis of player feeling. In order to get there, having a solid understanding up front about what the player feelings are for the various moments throughout your specific game. And then you'll be able to tune that feedback to juice those feelings. And if you're anything like me, making decisions about how to tune your juice in a coherent way, it's largely different by feel and intuition, but you can improve that. You can improve your intuition and feel for stuff like this by taking the time to do analysis like this on your own games. So with that, juice your games, but juice them responsibly. Make the feedback work for you and your intent. And juicing is not just a means of polish or making things look cool, but it's a tool at your disposal to push the player feelings in your game just a little bit further and make things just a little more coherent. So thank you for listening. And if you want to play the game, you can do so there. Thanks.